Massachusetts Democratic Senator Ed Markey claiming that this vote is sabotage, and, well, we called them, and so far we've got no response. So the Senate Majority Whip and South Dakota Republican Senator John Thune. Senator Thune, thanks for joining us.
Charles, nice to be with you. Thanks.
The notion that somehow this is sabotage, that Senator McConnell is pulling a fast one, what are your thoughts?
I don't think he's pulling a fast one. I think he's asking people to go on the record and find out where people are on this great, hot new idea that Democrats have come up with that somebody else gets to pay for.
Are you surprised, though, that all the declared Democratic candidates and many of those who are on the cusp of declaring have all said, hey, this is part of our platform, too. We support this?
It is kind of surprising, Charles, but I think if you look at where the Democrat Party in this country is moving, they've taken a hard socialist turn. And the issue with every one of these socialist fantasies is it sounds really good as long as somebody else is paying for it. But when you hand somebody the bill and they realize what the price tag is, all of a sudden they have a different impression. And I think that's where a majority of Americans, as they look at this and they listen to this discussion, that's where they're going to land. They're going to say, okay, they're realists. They're going to say, what does this thing cost? And they're going to do the cost benefit in their own minds and conclude that this is a really bad deal for American workers and American families who are going to get stuck paying the bill for all these socialist fantasies that some on the far left have come up with, and evidently a lot of the Democrat candidates for president have decided to embrace.
Well, if you look at the broad strokes, because that's all we really have, it feels like this perhaps is an extension of the social justice movement that was very prevalent under President Obama. If you look at some of the things, high-quality health care, affordable, safe, and adequate housing, economic security. These aren't necessarily climate change issues. These are sort of issues where they're telling the American public, hey, it's all going to be part and parcel of this major package. Climate change will be the headline, but we'll take care of all the ills of this country.
Right, and I think it stems from the sort of ideology that government knows best. And it knows best when it comes to, the decisions that people make in their daily lives. You know, they've got, if you look at the agenda that they've advanced, we're talking about a top marginal tax rate of 70%, a wealth tax at 90%, an increase in the business tax. You're talking about open borders. You're talking about Medicare for All, which costs $32 trillion. And the Green New Deal, which they say will cost the average family about $3,800 more in annual energy costs. So these are they're all part of this sort of utopia that a lot of the the government engineers in places like Washington come up with. But in the lives of the American people, they have real, practical, everyday costs, right. And that's what the American people are going to be looking at.
Senator Thune, speaking of open borders, I got to get your thoughts on this proposed shutdown resolution, or compromise, if you will, and the potential for President Trump to sign it and there being a vote on it.
Right. I think, Charles, there is, as you know, in a negotiation, some give and take. Nobody got everything that they wanted. But the point that I can tell people is the president is going to build the wall. And that's what the president wanted out of all this. He's going to get more wall, twice as much wall as was appropriated for in the last fiscal year, and 3 times as much as would have been allowed for in a continuing resolution had the government been funded that way.
Although he's getting a fraction of the money that he requested originally.
Sure. I mean, he's not getting what he wanted, and I think he knows that. There are other ways that he can get some of those dollars by reprogramming existing funds. He'll get there, but this is an incremental process, and this is a down payment. We've talked about it that way, but he is going to be building wall, and he got the Democrats to concede they weren't going to put a single dollar into wall funding. And if you look at what they were trying to do with capping the number of beds, the number of criminals that could be detained by Immigrations and Custom Enforcement, that also was a win. And I think the president can live to fight another day, but he's going to get wall funding, and I think that's the important message coming out of this discussion.
Senator John Thune, thank you very much. Always a pleasure.
Thanks, Charles.
Thank you.
Howard Schultz may have built a fabulously successful business in Starbucks, but he's hardly a household name yet. Now that the billionaire is doing a media blitz to test an independent campaign for 2020, imagine a billionaire as president? He's getting trashed in the more liberal precincts of the press.
Why not have that debate within the Democratic Party, of which you were a member up until recently?
Because I would have to be disingenuous to try and run as a Democrat.
Obviously, I don't want Howard Schultz to run for president. I think that his entry into the political stage has been catastrophically misjudged.
These guys, they're billionaires, so they think they can do anything. And, and one thing he could do is hand the re-election to Donald Trump.
Poor hapless Howard Schultz and his overfunded midlife crisis just got in their way. So they have to crush him.
Joining us now from New York, Ben Domenech, the founder and publisher of The Federalist. And Ben, so Howard Schultz is out there kind of testing the waters for a run. And what do you make of all of these anchors challenging him, all of these liberal commentators saying, how dare you run? Why don't you run as a Democrat? How is it their job to do that?
You know, in any other context, I think that they would be very receptive to Howard Schultz running. He's a classic example of, you know, someone who's socially liberal, fiscally conservative. We're told by all these different people that that's representative of where the centrist sort of thought process of this country ought to exist. And yet in this year, this is a situation where the left, which is represented, overrepresented in our media nationally, feels that they have the right to every anti-Donald Trump vote. And that's what they view Howard Schultz as disrupting, that he could potentially take away 3 to 5% or potentially more of that anti-Donald Trump vote and ultimately reelect him. That's what makes him inconvenient from their perspective. I actually think it's very interesting, and I don't just say that as someone who was at one time a Starbucks barista, served many people some very fine drinks at the time. That was my first job, and so I thank Howard Schultz for that.
Yeah.
But I have to say,
boycott Starbucks because we don't like Schultz.
No, I think that's ridiculous, and I think that this, you know, look, the guy bears a hearing. What I do think is telling, though, is that his positioning is really out of touch with the kind of person who could actually beat Donald Trump. Kristen Soltis-Anderson, who is a guest on your program, you know, occasionally, has a great piece in the Washington Post in which she outlines the fact that the real way to go after Donald Trump is with someone who is a populist when it comes to economic policy and is actually more traditionalist when it comes to social policy. That's where the actual sort of underrepresented center of the country really is when you look at the poll data. That's not where Schultz is, and it's ultimately why I think he's going to have a real problem being a significant candidate in the end.
I have people coming at me on Twitter saying, you shouldn't run for president. Your coffee is horrible, because I'm also a Howard, except without the billions. I've tried to tell them that. All right, let's talk about Kamala Harris. So she did a CNN town hall, and she came out from Medicare for All, which is becoming a popular Democratic position. And to his credit, Jake Tapper pressed her on how it would work. And she said, well, you know, we don't need people going through these insurance companies. Let's eliminate all of that. So just get rid of 150 million people's private insurance. And the press is covering this as just sort of like a political misstep.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think one of the big problems that you're going to see here for people like Kamala and others is that once you start running as a presidential candidate, a lot of these slogans and these ideas that you've thrown out as a member of the U.S. Senate over the years are going to be judged under new light of how feasible they actually are. And in the case of Medicare for All, we've seen time and again multiple states, you know, go down the road of doing some kind of single-payer program, either in Vermont or in California, and they can never make the math work. In a situation
but the media
like
scrutiny is a good thing, right, for Democrats as well as the constant scrutiny of Trump.
It is, and I think that this is one of the things that we're going to see develop over the course of this campaign, where a lot of these people are going to roll out ideas that they've maybe, you know, endorsed in the past, and they're going to have a new level of evaluation that they're going to have to live up to.
All right, Ben, we talked earlier in the show about Virginia Governor Ralph Northam now facing calls not just from Democrats, from a whole lot of media people to resign over the blackface/KKK photo in the yearbook back in 1984. One of your writers doesn't agree. You know, people are saying, well, it's offensive, but it was 35 years ago. Has this become a media mob?
You know, I think it has in a certain extent, though I do think it's funny that this media mob was driven up by this old photo as opposed to the governor's terrible comments earlier in this week endorsing, you know, letting a baby die, whether you think it's infanticide or not, after it's born, which, you know, from my perspective is truly the position of the elites of the Democratic Party and Planned Parenthood, a position that is out of step with the overwhelming majority of the American people.
So why, in your view, let me jump in, did so many networks and other news organizations either completely ignore the story or barely mention it or frame it as Republicans pounce on Northam remarks rather than having a healthy debate about late-term abortion legislation?
Howard, you and I both know that overwhelmingly the media is full of people who are extreme on the issue of abortion. They do not like the messy conversation that happens when you look at this issue in a hard way. You remember the Washington Post dismissing the Kermit Gosnell story as a local crime story. You know the fact that the way that these stories are often framed is as conservatives pouncing on the remarks of people in various positions that could be depicted as extreme, when the positions they hold are out of step with what the vast majority of Americans want. You and I both know that the polls consistently say that Americans want more restrictions on abortion, particularly late-term abortion. They're more moderate on the subject than the vast majority of members of the media. And I think in this context, when you look at what Ralph Northam has gone through this past week, I mean, it's a bold move to try to distract from your comments on infanticide with a sort of racist scandal from your college years.
I don't think that he planned that part of it, but just in the half a minute that we have left, what do you make of all the media calls for him to resign and that long and rather bizarre news conference yesterday?
If you know, I've seen a lot of bizarre news conferences in my day. I watched the Mark Sanford press conference live. This is the most bizarre thing I've ever seen. But if I was a major donor to the Democratic Party in Virginia, I would be looking at Ralph Northam right now the same way I would look at someone like Maduro. I need to give him a golden parachute to go somewhere. I need to give him a board to go sit on so that he can pay for private school and things like that going forward. He needs to have some kind of parachute to get out of that office, because frankly what he's done here, as embarrassing as it is, it's not necessarily an impeachable offense or something that they can drive him out of office for, but he's going to be a drag on Virginia Democrats going forward. They have a real shot at winning that legislature.
Right.
They need to get him out of there as quickly as possible for the sake of their party.
Well, certainly he's lost the confidence of the Democratic establishment in Virginia. Ben Domenech, great to have you back. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you as always.